Hello everybody, this is our final week looking at conflicts and tension as part of our assessment programme. So where are we at the minute? Well, we have done conflicts and tension twice already. So we've done the revision of the Versailles, the League, Abyssinia, etc. We've looked at the Rhineland, Munich Conference, Nazi-Soviet Pact. This week we're having a look at why the League failed and causes of World War II. Just mentioned on the last slide, we're looking at causes of World War II, including in particular appeasement and the Nazi-Soviet Pact, and we're also looking for reasons for the failure of the League of Nations. That's what you need to focus your revision on this week. This week then you're going to have to know two causes of World War II in detail. The first of those is appeasement. So what was appeasement? Well, during the 1930s, Britain decided not to stand up to Hitler and stand against his aggression. So the people of Britain not want to stand up to him. They wanted peace rather than having to stand up to him when he was breaking the rules, things like when he was rearming or remilitarising the Rhineland, for example. Instead, Britain backed down. They gave in to Hitler's demands, and this was called the policy of appeasement. To appease is to give in to let them have a little bit of what they wanted. So why did Britain let Hitler have what he wanted? Historians have often criticised the appeasers of the 1930s and said they allowed Hitler to get stronger and gain more confidence. But there were many good reasons behind it. So some of these included memories of the destruction of World War I. World War I was still fresh in the minds of many of the British people. Many people had obviously had loved ones who died or came back and were completely different. So World War I loomed large in the memories of the British people. Another reason why they didn't want to have a war and thought, well, it's better to give him what he wants a little bit, is because war is really, really expensive. And actually, at this point, there were so many people still living in slum housing. So money would be better spent on housing for the poor rather than on armaments that really weren't needed at this point. Linked to that one, the government hadn't been spending much on weapons, etc., and making Britain's armed forces more modern in the 1930s. So what we had was a real lack of military preparedness. In particular, the British hadn't massively invested in their air force, and at this point we didn't have a radar system. So it made sense to give in to Hitler because at this point we felt that we would have been defeated in a war. One of the really, really big reasons for appeasement was what Hitler was asking for seemed reasonable. By this point, towards the kind of middle to end of the 1930s, many people throughout Europe, but particularly in Britain, were feeling that the Treaty of Versailles had been harsh on Germany. So even though I said the destruction of World War I was that memory was still there in people's memories, but people had kind of moved on so much from blaming Germany, and they looked at the Treaty of Versailles and said, well, things like German troops on German land in the Rhineland, that didn't seem unreasonable. Germans in Austria wanted to join up with Germans in Germany. Again, that felt reasonable. So that was a really big reason for appeasement. The Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939, that had highlighted that we were now vulnerable to attack. In previous wars, Britain had felt a little bit like they could kind of escape it all, and they didn't need to worry so much because we were, of course, an island nation. We had a very strong navy. Now we knew the Germans could attack us and bomb our cities by air. And destruction of Spanish cities in 1937, such as Guernica, what that really did was demonstrate to the people of Britain that we were now vulnerable to attack. So appeasement was going to stop the destruction of our cities and the killing of our innocent civilians. Another really vital reason was all of this seemed a distant thing from Britain. It was all happening a long way away. Most people didn't really care about the Rhineland or Austria or the Sudetenland. They'd never even really heard of these places. So the thought of going to another big war with Germany over those places, well, that didn't seem like a very good idea. So appeasement was sensible based on what was going on in Britain at the time. So what actually happened under the policy of appeasement? Well, Britain and France allowed Hitler to break the Treaty of Versailles a number of times. They, of course, once rearmament was made public in 1935, well, the British and the French did nothing about that at that point. In fact, what what you could say is that they almost encouraged Hitler, because in 1935, of course, the British signed the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, where they allowed Germany to have up to 35% of a navy the size of Britain's. So they were saying, no, you don't need to have those 6 battleships anymore. As long as it's in line with that 35%, you can have what you want. So that's Britain actively encouraging Germany to rearm in a way. They also allowed him to remilitarise the Rhineland in 1936. We looked at this as part of our earlier conflicts and tension studies. So Hitler had got away with that in March of 1936, what he saw as his great gamble. This was the area that was supposed to give security to France. He'd put troops in, nothing had happened. Anschluss with Austria in 1938. So remember, Hitler invaded Austria, but then 99.75% of the population of Austria, the people that went out and voted in 1938, they agreed to the Anschluss. And so the British and the French would have been very silly indeed to have said, well, actually, no, this doesn't seem legal to us. So they appeased over that, because Austria, after all, had the same history, culture, language, heritage as Germany. So it made sense, it felt reasonable that the Germans and the Austrians would unite. But the most important part of appeasement leading up to World War II was the Sudeten crisis. So remember what was going to happen with the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, which culminated in the Munich Agreement of 1938. So when it looked like war was going to happen in September, eventually a negotiation was had, which ended in giving Hitler the Sudetenland. So this was the height of appeasement. Many people in Britain saw this as a triumph. This was negotiation beating force. So Britain had managed to avoid war, which looked so likely when he returned home after his second visit to Hitler on the 22nd of September. Others criticised it as giving in to a bully. And that's what some people said about appeasement. We're just letting the bully get more and more. We're letting him get stronger and stronger. It's important to note that Chamberlain never fully trusted Hitler. The Munich Agreement did avoid war at that moment. It did allow Britain to build up their armed forces, and it did allow the British to set up a radar network. And that was a really important reason why Britain were able to resist Germany in 1940. But that's what appeasement was all about. Under these circumstances that we can see here, the British and the French decided not to challenge Germany because of those reasons we saw on the last slide. Well, it all seemed like a very long way away. This didn't really seem to have much to do with us. Versailles maybe had been a little bit harsh. So all of these things led to these incidents. Was appeasement a good idea? We're going to have a look at reasons for and against it. So we know that ultimately it did not work and war was not avoided. We go to war in September 1939. So what are the key arguments for and against it? So in terms of, what people have found out over the years, well, the reason why appeasement was a good thing is because actually the Treaty of Versailles in many ways had been unfair. They had lost land, such as 3 million German citizens living with the Sudetenland. Well, that didn't go with self-determination, so that did seem unfair. So that was a good reason why appeasement was something that was the right policy for Britain. Also, it goes with those ideas of we always should negotiate before we go to war anyway. It's right to try and negotiate. And actually, Britain had to think of a way around this because the League weren't able to keep the peace. So Britain had to follow their own policy that was about avoiding war. A really massive reason why appeasement was a good idea at this point was because people in Britain did not want war. They did not support a war. They wanted to try everything to avoid it first. And so what appeasement did was it proved to the British people, yeah, we have done everything. By the time we hit 1939, particularly after Hitler invades Czechoslovakia in March 1939, the British people then turn and they now do support war. And that support of war probably wouldn't have happened had we not gone through appeasement beforehand and shown that we had done everything reasonable. I've mentioned this next one a number of times already. It gave Britain extra time to rearm, so particularly the appeasement in the Munich Agreement of September 1938. And Nazi Germany was a good way to stop Russia growing, having that strong nation in the centre of Europe. There was a real fear in Britain at the time that communism coming from Russia was going to sweep through Europe. Having Hitler slap bang in the middle of Europe was going to stop that from happening. So allowing him to be relatively strong was a defence against communism. So all of those are the reasons why many people have argued over the years that appeasement was really the only policy that Germany could have followed. Sorry, that Britain could have followed. So let's have a look at against. The top one's really, really important. What appeasement did was it made Hitler despise those people. It convinced him that he could keep on taking more and more. We've talked about this before, as he believed that he saw, increasingly saw the British and the French leaders as being worms, as being spineless, no backbone. And every time they gave him more, he thought he had the right to take more because nobody would block him and stand in his way. So appeasement, all it did was it allowed Hitler to grow and grow in confidence. On top of that, it allowed them to grow physically strong. Not only did they gain territory, but they also gained extra resources. In particular, when we looked at the Sudeten crisis, we remember how the Sudetenland was full of modern armaments factories. Well, Hitler gained all of that stuff because of appeasement. Another reason why appeasement should be seen as a bad thing is it allowed people to be part of Nazi rule. Had we not had appeasement, the Austrians, the Czechs, for example, they would not have been, part of Nazi Germany, and perhaps that, the Jews, the Holocaust would not have been as bad had Hitler been stood up to earlier by the British and the French. Really, really importantly, appeasement made Britain look stupid. Once it had gone wrong, once it was obvious that Hitler could not be reasoned with and was going to take more whatever, at that point it made Britain look really, really weak and pathetic. And it made it look as if we were easily duped and tricked. Now, our second cause of World War II that we're going to look at in detail is the Nazi-Soviet Pact. Now, I'm not going to talk about this in detail with you today because we already did this last week. This is one that you should already be feeling familiar with. You should know what the background to this was. You should know that, and this is linked to the last one, of course, you should know that the British and French had followed appeasement. When that had gone wrong with the invasion of Czechoslovakia, that they had promised to defend Poland. Well, we also know that Hitler did not take this threat seriously because of what had been going on with appeasement for the previous years. He believed that if he wanted to take more land, if he wanted to take Poland, he could do it. And Britain and France probably wouldn't do anything because they hadn't done anything yet. But Hitler didn't feel confident because he was concerned about Russia, the Soviet Union. It was too big a gamble to potentially face war with Britain and France, who he wasn't really worried about, but Russia as well. We also know from our studies last week that Chamberlain wanted an alliance with Russia. The British did. But actually, the British sent this lowly nobody, this minor official across, and so there was no agreement or alliance made between these two countries. Stalin never really believed that the British wanted an agreement with Russia. They believed they would betray him and appease Hitler, just like they'd done to the Czechs in 1938. What actually happened? Well, we know that it was the Russians who asked the Nazis for an alliance. Hitler didn't send a minor official, he sent Ribbentrop. The first part of the process was this trade treaty being signed. And we also know then that on the 23rd of August, this was the non-aggression pact, where they would not fight each other. But we also know that the more shocking details of it was his agreement to attack Poland and divide it between them. That's what the Nazi-Soviet Pact was all about. The results of the pact were obviously very important. This gave Hitler the confidence to invade Poland. He knew about the promise made by Britain to Poland, but didn't take it seriously. So on the 1st of September, just 9 days after the agreement had been signed, he launched Blitzkrieg on Poland. The British demanded the withdrawal, but Hitler thought that they were bluffing. He didn't believe that the British actually would stand up. But on the 3rd of September, Chamberlain did declare war, and that was followed by the French declaration of war as well. So this directly led to World War II. Without the Nazi-Soviet Pact, Hitler would have had to have rethought his strategy. There were, of course, other causes of World War II. For our assessment this time round, you're not going to need to know any of these in detail, but you do need to know that these actually existed. Another reason why World War II broke out was because the League of Nations had collapsed. This was another organisation that could and should have been monitoring things and stopping aggression. But of course, we know that following the Abyssinian crisis, at the end, by the time we get to May 1936, and Abyssinia has been totally taken over by the Italians, we know that by that point the League essentially died. Another key reason why World War II broke out was because of all the problems caused by the Great Depression. The Great Depression, of course, that's one of the key reasons why Hitler came to power. It's one of the key reasons why the Japanese invaded Manchuria and why the Italians invaded Abyssinia, and all of those, of course, directly link to the collapse of the League of Nations. The League of Nations partially collapsed because of the Great Depression. So those are completely interlinked there. And of course, it caused countries like Britain, France, etc. to want to appease rather than to go to war because they couldn't really afford to. So all of those things so far are really interlinked. But probably one of the greatest reasons why war broke out was the things that Hitler did in the 1930s. It's very easy for us to look at it and say, well, actually, World War II broke out because Britain followed a policy of appeasement. Well, Britain wouldn't have needed a policy of appeasement had Hitler not been so aggressive. So all of those actions, that secret rearmament, the more outward showing of rearmament from 1935, the remilitarisation of the Rhineland, Anschluss with Austria, the Sudeten crisis, the invasion of Czechoslovakia, the Nazi-Soviet pact, and the invasion of Poland. All of those actions were the stepping stones to war, and we can lay those very, very firmly at the door of Hitler. Our second area that we're looking at this week is we're going to be looking at the failure of the League of Nations. We're going to have one question, which is going to be on causes of World War II, and our second question is going to be on the failure of the League of Nations. And what we're going to do today is we're going to have a look at three main reasons why the League of Nations ended. So, as it says at the top here, we know the League of Nations had virtually collapsed by 1939. We also know that this was rooted in many causes, some of them to do with the League itself and others to do with circumstances of the 1930s. So here's some of the main reasons for the failure of the League. So one of the really, really big reasons why the League of Nations collapsed was because Britain and France never fully committed to the League of Nations. So from the very beginning, neither was very, very encouraging about it. They believed in some ways that the League it was a little bit too ambitious and it would fail. It was the insistence of the USA that this was included in the Treaty of Versailles. And as soon as the USA decided not to join, we could almost say that the League was doomed from the start. And part of that is because, Britain and France weren't committed. They weren't willing to lend their own League, the League, their own armies. And the reason for that was they were really bothered about their own empires in places like Asia and Africa, and they wouldn't sacrifice the security of their colonies to help the League. So Britain and France were looking out for their own interests rather than really trying to make the League successful. The most obvious example of this country's lack of commitment and self-interest can be seen in the Abyssinia incident. So we can talk generally about the lack of commitment for the British and French, and we absolutely have to do that. We have to look at kind of how they felt about the League and the fact that they weren't really willing to commit to it or lend it an army. And we can see that in the case study of Abyssinia. So both countries had armies in North and East Africa because they had colonies in those areas. They had empire there. And they could easily have militarily stopped Mussolini. They had the ability at this point to do this. They also jointly owned the Suez Canal. Had they blocked the canal, had they said, no, the Italians are not allowed to use it at the moment, it would have made the invasion much more difficult, in fact, more or less practically impossible. Britain and France prepared to give Mussolini what he wanted. So just like they appeased Hitler leading up to World War II, they appeased Mussolini here. So they allowed him to use the Suez Canal. And they didn't really want the League to punish him very much because they wanted him as an ally. What they didn't want was the Italians and Germans to form an alliance. They thought, well, if we're nice to Mussolini, he'll stay on our team and he won't be kind of making alliances with Hitler. So this meant they plotted behind the back of the League. So this isn't just them showing a lack of commitment to the League of Nations. It's actually going a little bit further than that. This is where they're betraying the League of Nations, and they negotiated the Hall-of-Out Pact, which is where they had decided they would give Mussolini 2/3 of Abyssinia. Now we know that that never came off and it never happened, but this caused reputational damage to the League. It demonstrated to Mussolini that Britain and France didn't really want to stop him, and it certainly demonstrated to other countries that Britain and France didn't care about the League. They wouldn't help it, they wouldn't stand up for it. In fact, they would do everything they can to kind of throw a spanner in the works. The League never recovered from that incident. So why did the League of Nations fail? Well, it failed because Britain and France didn't do enough to help it. And so we've got some general reasons why that happened, and we've also got the very, very tight example there, the tight case study of what happened in Abyssinia. Let's look then at a second reason why the League of Nations failed. So, well, the League of Nations failed because it had membership issues. Not enough countries were members. Yeah, by the time we get to the 1930s, we got about 59, 60 members, but in total, less than a third of the world's nations were members. You had important countries who were missing. And so when we're writing about the failure of the League of Nations here, we focus on 3 of those countries and why their absence led to the failure of the League of Nations. So the first really big mistake that the League of Nations made was not allowing Germany to join. So Germany, the people who they'd seemed to blame for the First World War, were not allowed in this club that was there to try and stop war in the future. That seems silly, and that gave the League this reputation as being a winners' club. Most of the countries in the League of Nations had been on the same side in World War I or had had nothing to do with it. So this made the League look bad from day one. Russia, the USSR, was also not allowed because they had a very different system of government, this communist government that had come into power in 1917, and other countries viewed them with suspicion. It was different to any government across the world. Russia seemed very closed off. And what this did to the League, and this is what we're interested in here, why this led to the failure of the League, was it made the League seem very narrow-minded. They only wanted one type of country to join the League of Nations. And it also meant that a really big country who might be problematic, well, they were outside of League influence. So already we've got 2 countries not members, and that again not just damages the reputation, but it also damages the strength of the League, not having 2 big powerful nations as part of it. So there are 2 countries who damaged kind of the membership of the League. The biggest and most important absence was that of the USA, of course. Woodrow Wilson had devised, he'd come up with the League, and the fact that the USA did not join seriously undermined it. So he'd invented this thing, and then his country never bothered to join. That made the League look a little bit pathetic. Not only did it look bad that the inventors of the League did not join, but it meant that sanctions were seriously weakened. A couple of weeks ago, we looked at sanctions in detail, and of course, what it meant was that economic sanctions in particular would never really work, because America by this point was the world's leading trading nation. So if the League did decide to punish a country with economic sanctions, that country could simply trade with the USA. So it wasn't such a punishment as it would have been had America been a member. So we can already think about how that can link to that first paragraph that we've just looked at. So the first paragraph was about the lack of commitment from Britain and France. Well, that links to membership issues. Maybe Britain and France would have been more committed if America had been the leaders of the League and had they joined. So we can see, even though these are separate reasons for the failure of the League, they're actually quite interlinked. Let's look then at our final reason for why the League of Nations failed. Well, the League of Nations also failed because of its structure and its organisation. So we've got stuff to do with what the members themselves were like, we've got stuff to do with the membership, and we've got stuff now to do with the actual setup of the League. So the main body of the League of Nations was the Assembly. It was kind of like this world parliament, but they only met once a year. That's not a lot. And all their decisions had to be unanimous. Every single person, every single country had to agree. And that made decision making slow and really difficult to achieve. And we're going to look at a case study, an example of that in a little while. The Council, the council decided what was to happen in times of crisis, they found decision-making difficulty, as all countries could veto the League from taking action. That meant they could block what it was that the League was going to do. So if they were kind of negotiating on economic sanctions, for example, if one of these council members decided to vote against it, they could actually stop the action from taking place. The bit that did all the paperwork of the League of Nations was called the Secretariat. It's the bureaucracy, the kind of civil service of the League of Nations. Well, this particular group was seriously understaffed. Well, that links, doesn't it, to what we've got about slow, difficult decision making. The group that had to kind of put it all down on paper, get everything prepared, there wasn't enough people there. So that led to this slowness, and that leads to slowness, particularly in the crisis that we're going to have a look at in Manchuria. It took 13 months for that report to be written. Another key reason why the League of Nations failed points to what we looked at together a few weeks ago, to do with sanctions being weak. Moral sanctions, easily ignored. Economic sanctions didn't work in the Depression, and of course with America not being there, and it didn't have an army of its own. And of course what that meant was that military sanctions were never really possible. All of these were structural and organisational difficulties of the League of Nations. So then we can use this case study again. So the most obvious example of the League's structural organisation causing problems was the Manchuria crisis. The League investigators did not arrive in Manchuria until April 1932, despite the fact the incident had begun in September 1931 and the Chinese had asked for an investigation from the October. And even after they arrived in April 1932, there was no report finalised until October 1932, 13 months after the original invasion. By this time, the Japanese had invaded more territory. When they were told, the Japanese, you must leave China, your actions are illegal, we condemn you, in February 1933, so this is now, look, this is a year and a half later, the Japanese simply left the League and no further action was taken. This was a lack of speed, which is to do with the organisation of the League of Nations, and this led to other countries breaking the rules. So the incident could have been so much better dealt with had the League got better structures in place. So dead easy homework this week, you need to revise this content. This content should be really easy because it's very much linked to some of the content that we've been doing in other weeks.